The starkest example we see in the world today of this culture of violence, as I refer to it, is occurring in the West African country of Mali. The salafist movement, Ansar ad-Din, and other al-Qaeda-linked terrorists are threatening to eradicate this country's rich traditions of poetry, scholarship, and Islamic spirituality. Most recently, the insurgents set fire to a library containing thousands of priceless historic manuscripts, some of which date back to the 13th century. And as you may know, there's some conflicting news reports about how many of them were actually destroyed, but nonetheless, the entire library was burnt to the ground. The vast majority of the texts are in Arabic, some are in a few African languages, and there was even one in Hebrew. They covered a diverse range of topics, not just Islamic scholarship, but astronomy and poetry and music, medicine, and even women's rights. Since most were never digitized, some of this knowledge and history may be lost forever. The militants have also banned all types of music, even cell phone ringtones, and have canceled the annual Desert Music Festival, which drew musicians from around the world for over 10 years. At the same time, militants have also led a campaign to obliterate the cultural sites of Timbuktu. It includes 16 mausoleums of ancient Muslim saints that were on the list of endangered cultural sites of UNESCO. Unfortunately, this type of cultural destruction is taking place in all corners of the world by violent extremist networks, many of which are driven by Salafi ideologies, not entirely. And to be specific, the lexicon, of course, is a controversial thing, so I'm going to try to be as specific as I can about what groups I'm referring to. And I'm using the example of Salafi militant networks as opposed to Shia and other factions, but they use a radical interpretation of Islam to justify the use of violence for political purposes and to propagate a very dogmatic worldview. I've personally been studying these movements for over 2 decades now, in Southeast and Central Asia specifically, and in England and the UK. Most recently, or as Juliana talked to you about briefly, we carried out a comprehensive study of Pakistan across 35 cities and villages to study just how the extremist networks in that country are affecting Pakistan's diverse heritage. And I'll refer more to that in my presentation. So let's be a little more specific about the defining features of Salafi movements. So our research indicates that while these movements vary in ideological beliefs and their means to achieve power, there are 3 key defining features of these modern movements. First, the practice of declaring certain customs and traditions as bid'ah, or heretical, thereby stripping Islam of its cultural norms and of its landmarks. And to uphold the belief, the Salafi militants have also destroyed burial places of the Prophet Muhammad himself and his family, despite their significance as sacred sites to Muslims around the world. Elsewhere, they destroy saints' shrines and prohibit the visitation of graves by claiming it promotes idol worship. Second is the principle of takfirism, which many of you may have heard of, which is the radical belief that any Muslim who does not practice Islam as they define it is deemed an unbeliever and may be killed. It is important to note that for many Salafis, this label of unbeliever also extends to Jews and Christians, who historically and traditionally in Islam were respected as people of the book. This demonizing of the other, whether it's fellow Muslims or people of other faiths, has spawned a culture of hatred around the world that leads to violence and contradicts the universal rights of religious freedom. It also defies the classical Islamic belief that tolerance and diversity and pluralism are what strengthen a society. Third is the interpretation of jihad. So historically, as you know, and you've probably heard this as well, that jihad is meant to be a struggle in the way of God. It means both an internal struggle to control one's ego, and it also has a very narrow definition of combative jihad, which can only be implemented in accordance with strict principles of warfare. Nonetheless, militant Salafi groups ignore the principles and the rules required to sanction an external jihad, and instead selectively cite verses of the Quran to justify violence and to propagate, once again, their worldview. So the methods of gaining power. These groups seek to influence the society and power through 2 main mechanisms. One, which we're pretty familiar with, is the social welfare and building of social welfare institutions. Across North Africa, Ansar Sharia parties have established and applied what we call the Hezbollah model of social welfare influence. They provide low-income families with free food, medical facilities, and education to gain public support for their actions. The latest Ansar party was founded in mid-October in Egypt and has already begun providing food for the needy. Militants also use intimidation tactics to solidify their power. The Taliban's systematic assassination of moderate Afghan clerics and their destruction of the 6th century Buddha statues in 2001 are classical examples of this. In Pakistan, thousands of tribal elders and cultural thought leaders have been kidnapped, ransomed, or killed, disrupting very complex social structures. In the Khyber Agency, for example, member of the National Assembly and former federal minister, Sheikh Nurul Qadri has had 16 members of his family murdered or kidnapped and held for ransom. Across the world, violent extremists are following a similar model of killing off the thought leaders who protect the social structures of these societies and desecrating their cultural landmarks in an effort to replace these historical norms with more rigid and austere value structures. Overwhelmingly, the primary targets in Africa and South Asia have been Muslim institutions and shrines. In Pakistan, for example, over 20 shrines were attacked in 2010 alone. These institutions are often world-renowned for their architecture. However, they are culturally significant to these populations because they are places where the society can showcase linguistic development, theological research, as well as support the arts, music, and poetry, and sacred movement. In Mali, the madrasas in the historic city of Timbuktu, which have been traditional centers of scholarship for Arabic language and culture, have also served as the heart of secular and religious life since the 15th century. Cultural landmarks such as shrines are also important because they foster inclusivity in these societies. In Pakistan, for example, the tomb complexes of the saints are visited by people of all faiths. The Sikhs and the Hindus also worship there, and they're considered sacred spaces for Sunnis and Shias alike. Likewise, even socially conservative places like Afghanistan, these shrines are some of the few public places where women are allowed to pray and to meditate. In short, because these centers of Islamic spirituality are often cultivating an ethos of tolerance and social harmony, they pose a direct threat to the extremist ideologues. And this is really important because some people wonder, why is there this, very vicious attack on these shrines? And so, as we mentioned, it's part of the bid'ah and the takfiri mentality, but it's also to destroy the social fabric of these countries that has existed for centuries. In addition to targeting the religious sites, militants also target the cultural thought leaders who historically have championed pluralism and denounced intolerance. In 2009, in Pakistan, Dr. Safraz Naimi was killed in a suicide bombing in his school right after he publicly denounced the Taliban. And as a result of such high-profile attacks, people are very afraid of challenging the Taliban and instead are embedding their anti-Taliban messages within other broader social issues. In August of this year, the 74-year-old spiritual leader Saeed Effendi of the Republic of Dagestan, who was working to bring peace between warring Islamic factions, was killed by a female suicide bomber posing as his student. This was the second such spiritual leader in this remote region alone to have been killed by terrorists in the past year. Also in Yemen, the al-Qaeda-affiliated Ansar al-Sharia has increased assassination attempts against popular peace committee leaders. Violent extremists are also targeting the non-Muslim monuments and traditions and places of burial. In December 2011, Boko Haram, the Nigerian militant group, claimed responsibility for a series of attacks on Christmas Day at churches across the country, one of which killed 35 people. In Egypt, as you may know, the Coptic churches are being destroyed by Salafi militants at an alarming rate after the revolution, and construction and development is simultaneously being prohibited. In Somalia, the terrorist organization Al-Shabaab desecrated Christian crosses and graves. In Libya, the rebels in Benghazi smashed the headstones and crucifixes of more than 150 British servicemen killed in North Africa. Similarly, in Pakistan, masked men carrying weapons and excavation tools desecrated over 100 tombs in the Ahmadi graveyard. Finally, some of the militants' target include ancient historical landmarks. So we know of the Bamiyan statues in Afghanistan, but in Morocco, the militants destroyed the 8,000-year-old stone carvings in the High Atlas Mountains. One of the carvings, called the Plaque of the Sun, predates the arrival of the Phoenicians in Morocco. Similarly, in Pakistan, the Taliban partially destroyed the 2,000-year-old Buddha statue in 2007. The statue was considered one of the largest in Asia after the destruction of the Buddhas in Afghanistan. This grim social engineering project, as I call it, has at least five very serious implications for regional and international security. First, these attacks eliminate and silence the moderate voices in these societies. It undermines their pluralistic social norms and creates dangerous opportunities for radical ideologies to prevail. In Pakistan, extremist movements have mainstreamed radical rhetoric, particularly takfirism, over the past 30 years. As a result, the society is becoming more intolerant, and fundamental freedoms such as religious liberty are almost disappearing. This effectively paves the way for the hardline forces to rise. As a result, there are an ever-increasing number of militant groups functioning around the world beyond Taliban and Al-Qaeda. They include groups like Jabhat al-Nusra of Syria, the Ansar al-Sharia of Libya and Tunisia, and many others that we've listed here. The second very important consequence is that they are responsible for fueling sectarian and communal violence. Last year in Pakistan, sectarian militants killed nearly 400 Shia Muslims. Unfortunately, the frequency of these attacks is increasing. Just recently, on January 10, 2013, over 100 Shia were killed in twin attacks in Quetta, sparking days of civil unrest and protests across the country. Targeted violence against minorities has also forced entire communities to migrate. According to NGO reports, about 3,000 Hindus have fled the country. These trends are particularly disconcerting because historically, it's this type of communal violence that has pushed countries into civil war. Third is the risk posed to our transitional democracies. Violent extremist groups have used the Arab Revolution and political instability to mobilize their support base and gain considerable influence in these societies. In Egypt, for example, the recent elections brought an unprecedented number of Salafis to the National Assembly. They have been driving an Islamist agenda, calling for the immediate implementation of austere Sharia law and a reduction of women's rights and the prohibition of the construction of new churches. Many also feel that the rule of law, until it is fully restored, the extremists are enjoying a free rein to burn churches and attack Coptic homes. There are indications that other transitional democracies are also at risk. In Libya, in late August 2012, armed militants set fire to a historic library, burning centuries of rare academic and religious resources to the ground. Two Christians were also recently killed in an attack in the church in the city of Misurita, the latest in a series of sectarian attacks that began a few weeks after the July elections. These attacks, like the one on the consulate in Benghazi, are symptomatic of the dire weakness of the state and of the reign of local militias. Similarly, in Tunisia, there have been several attacks on cultural and tourist sites since the revolution. In October, 5 masked men burned a 500-year-old shrine of a 13th century female saint. The attack comes as secularists increasingly worry that Tunisia's moderate Islamist ruling party is not confronting the extremist elements that have grown more active since the revolution. In mid-June, an art gallery in Tunis was vandalized and the artwork was destroyed, triggering riots that left 1 person dead and more than 100 people injured. In August, where militants prevented a comedy show from taking place, the Tunisian Ministry of Culture issued a statement saying the Salafis were posing a threat to the freedom of expression and to the cultural rights of the people. However, it's important to know that law enforcement was not dispatched and to defuse the situation. In September, a hotel serving alcohol was raided by dozens of armed Salafis. concerts have also been canceled due to pressure and intimidation by the militants. The fourth international risk is the militarization of formerly peaceful segments of society. In order to defend themselves and their communities against the militant groups, previously non-violent activists are now resorting to weapons for protection. So this is a very short-term solution with even greater negative repercussions for these societies and the rest of the world. In Pakistan, they formed these defensive militias known as lashkars. However, the majority of these outfits are very underfunded and poorly resourced to respond to global terrorist networks. So as a result, they're probably the first targets killed by militants. Last but not least, the greatest threat, at least to the international community, is that many of these militant groups operate on a transnational basis thanks to their international funding networks. As a result, these conflicts are rarely constrained within single borders, and the world is subject to greater acts of terrorism. The Pakistan-based anti-Shia militia group, Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, for example, was responsible for the cross-border attacks in Afghanistan. In 2011, a group connected to Lashkar-e-Jhangvi claimed responsibility for coordinating one of the deadliest multi-city attacks in a single day at the major shrines in Kabul, Kandahar, and Mazar Sharif. Similarly, attacks in Somalia led by Al-Shabaab are having a spillover effect in the neighboring countries like Kenya, as well as for the United States. Al-Shabaab has also recruited many US-based Somalis for fighting overseas. In September 2011, a senior American military commander for Africa warned that Al-Shabaab, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, and Boko Haram of Nigeria were forging an alliance to coordinate attacks on the US and Western interests. So if we were to use Mali as a case study, it's very important to understand how the rise of the militant groups pose this great international security problem. So, as some of you may know, Mali has been in crisis since last January, when a separatist uprising began in the north and was supported by an influx of foreign fighters and weapons from Libya after the fall of Colonel Gaddafi. The country fell into further disarray when a military coup challenged the government's actions against the protesters. Within weeks, militants linked to Al-Qaeda capitalized on the political instability, pushed the secular separatists aside, and took over northern towns where they were enforcing an austere and brutal interpretation of Sharia law. Before the militant insurgency reached the capital, the French military intervened and sent troops to Mali to eradicate the extremists. The French government reports that the coin operations that they engaged in were successful, but they fear that the Western involvement will provoke further terrorist attacks. In fact, as you know, there was the militants who stormed the gas facility in Algeria last week, resulting in the deaths of 80 people, including 37 foreign hostages, which they claim is in retaliation to the French intervention in Mali. So, unfortunately, this is a very grim picture I paint for you, but the reason I thought it was important to put this in a global context is that a lot of people read the articles about what's going on in Mali, and some people focus on Pakistan, that it was very important to pull it all together and have people understand that this is actually a very severe and challenging global threat. And though the overwhelming majority of Muslims and non-Muslims around the world are horrified by these acts of destruction and violence, many communities, especially in these at-risk countries, they feel powerless to stop it. Activists who do attempt to challenge it are confronted with a number of serious challenges and limitations. And of course, the biggest obstacle is security. As I mentioned to you about the targeted assassinations, leaders in at-risk communities around the world, whether it's Pakistan, Afghanistan, Nigeria, Libya, or Tunisia, subject themselves to grave personal danger if they try to intervene. The militants are armed and have a ruthless disregard for life. Where the rule of law is also weak, law enforcement does not intervene, they don't stop the crimes, and they don't arrest or prosecute the destruction of property and even murder. Therefore, to get involved is often a death sentence. Second, the lack of resources is a major challenge for civil society activists who want to create a public awareness campaign, for example, about the threat these movements pose to their cultural heritage. They lack communication and networking skills to mobilize these communities into action. They don't know how to organize a letter-writing campaign, for example, to have local media and government and UNESCO take action. It's important to note that most of these community-based organizations do not receive support from international organizations. They rely on these small community donations for their programs. They have a shortage of manpower, which further constrains their efforts. While extremist factions have been developing their institutional capacity for years, the moderate groups, both faith-based and secular, are for all practical purposes decades behind them. In light of these challenges, many activists feel helpless against the Salafi encroachment. So what can we do? As part of a global initiative to counter violent extremism, if you have heard our government as well, we have the Strategic Implementation Plan of the White House to counter violent extremism. Western governments, ours and others, have a vested interest in protecting and supporting moderate thought leaders as well as the world's cultural and historical legacies. Whether it's helping communities develop a neighborhood watch, teaching them how to respond to threats with nonviolent social mobilization techniques, or engaging communities in media or other social campaigns to raise awareness. The strategy of bolstering and protecting these groups and institutions is a vital part of decreasing the rise of militant Salafi movements. But the process is slow and it is difficult. Many of these mainstream groups lack the organizational infrastructure, like we discussed, and international standards of governance. However, if aid organizations have the will and the fortitude to invest in the mainstream Muslim society actors who are willing to learn and develop their skills to address this threat, we can create a force multiplier whereby extremist militias are disempowered, their radical ideologies delegitimized, and their agenda to destroy the traditional cultures can be dismantled. The ability to preserve a common world heritage goes hand in hand with reducing violent extremism and international terrorism. Such an agenda would not only reduce global conflict, but will significantly bolster Americans' contribution to the global security in the 21st century.